Hey guys, and welcome to the first episode of our tutorial series where I teach you how to make your own bullet hell game in Gamemaker Studio 2. So what I've done here is I've simply created a project called Bullet Hell, and the only thing that I've done apart from that is set the name of the default room to room game. Now this doesn't really affect anything, it's just that I prefer things being named a certain way. So if we run this now, we can see that I haven't done anything because nothing's happening here. So what we first need to do is add an object here, obj player, and drag it in to the room. This just puts the object into the room. However, if you can see, there's still nothing because we haven't set it as sprite and we haven't set it in image to look like, essentially. So we can make a sprite here called SBR player, and as a placeholder we can set it to be a 32 by 32 green square here. And now that we've done that, we can set the player object to look like sprite player. And if we run it now, we've got a green square. And now we haven't actually done anything because I haven't coded anything in this. So what we can first do is make a create event and set its description to set up variables, because that's what you use the create event for. So what we first do is we need to set the controls that you're going to be using to actually play the game. So we can do this by setting some variables: control up, control down, control left, control right. So we can all set this to equal the keyboard, like the key that you want it to, use. So we do this by doing ORD, and then as a string using speech marks W. So what this does is that ORD is basically a function that converts this string to the keyboard corresponding on the keyboard. So because Gamemaker doesn't actually recognize this being any specific key on the keyboard, so this ORD does it for us. So what we can do now is finish this off. So WSA and D, and if you've noticed, we'll be using a WSD control scheme for this. And then next, what we can do is set up movement variables, which we'll be using to move the player. So the move speed, the horizontal movement, and the vertical movement, and also the direction. And if you notice here, Gamemaker is actually prompting us to use this variable called direction, but we don't want to use that because we're like, hey Gamemaker, we want to use our own variables here, and we don't want you to affect the player because we're using your variables. So we can set this all to these hmov and vmov to equal 0, and direction to also equal 0, because it's not going to be a constant, it's going to be something that we're going to be calculating the value of using certain things. However, movement speed is going to be constant and it's going to be free, and we're not really going to change that throughout the whole thing. So if we go back to the workspace, we can create a step event which basically runs all the time. So it's really good if you want to check like constantly for stuff. So we can do everything, because I'm yet to find a good description for the step event. So now first we need to do is get the keyboard inputs, because right now Gamemaker's just got these variables here and they're like, yeah, what do I do with them? You can even see they're like variable control up only referenced once. So they're like, hey, you're not actually doing anything with these variables. And we're like, yeah, we're gonna use these variables to get the keyboard inputs. So we can do key up equals keyboard check press, no, not press, just keyboard check to control up. Now game makers realize that we're using these variables to set these variables. So what this actually does is that this function checks the keyboard whether this key here is actually being held down. For example, control up is W key, so this line would set this variable to true or false whether the keyboard is actually being pressed. So we're gonna use these, and we're gonna set the rest of these variables and use all of these control variables right here. So you can set these to control down, key right equals keyboard check, control can't type today, control right, and key left to equal keyboard check control left. Now game makers, like, yeah, you've used these now, but still only reference once, so we're not actually using these. So what we can do now is calculate like how the player's gonna move using these keys. So calculate movement. So what we can do is set hmov and vmov. You see these variables that we declared earlier, to hmov to key right minus key left, all in brackets, multiplied by the move speed. So what this does is that this key right minus key left essentially tells us what direction we're going to be going using these variables here. And as I said earlier, that these are set to true or false, but true or false can also mean 1 or 0, so you can do some clever maths with it without having to use unnecessary if statements. So we can do the same with vmov, do key down minus key up times move speed, and then we can, like, we've got all these variables here, but we still aren't affecting the player, so we can move the player, and simple two lines, x plus equals hmov and y plus equals vmov. So now if we run this, we've already got a simple green square that can move around. However, this isn't all of it, because firstly we still haven't used this direction variable here, so Gamemaker screaming at us. And also, if you notice very closely, like side by side movement is slightly slower than diagonal movement. This is because Gamemaker's moving both left and up equal amounts, which isn't good. So what we need to do is calculate the direction, and then use that direction to actually find out where you're going to move the player. So this right here, calculate movement, is a lie. And what we're actually using these variables is to calculate direction. The earlier variable here, dir, we can set it to equal point direction xy, I should put a space, and x plus hmov and y plus vmov. Now what this function does here is it takes in two specific points and figures out the direction between them. So x and y are the x and y of your current position, and that's where you're gonna go, because calculated by these earlier, this pretty much does the job. So we can tell that this is where you want to move. So you can use this to calculate the movement, and here we can actually set hmov and vmov again to what we're actually going to use to, like, move the player. So length direction x, length direction y. So what these two functions do give us is that it gives us the x and y of a position that's a certain direction and distance from, like, the origin. So because you can see these parameters here, length and direction. So length from the origin and direction from the origin as well. So what we can do is set the length to the movement speed, because that's how much we want to move, and direction to direction here. So if I just do this for the same here, we can see that if I run this, this works even more almost perfectly, because you see, if I don't press anything, Gamemaker's just like, hey, yeah, you're moving right, because if I'm pressing nothing, it's all 0, 0, 0. Like, this would still calculate to be 0, because if something's on top of each other, Gamemaker just, it doesn't really have any sort of null variable. It just sort of says, hey, 0. So this will just calculate, hey, you're going right, because 0. So Gamemaker moves the players right, which isn't correct. So what we do is add some more variables, h input and v input, and set it to key right plus key left. And what this actually does is that it gets these and just adds them together, so you get a number from 0 to 2. So, but this isn't actually right, because in order for it to be a true or false, which we want it to be, it has to be between 0 and 1. So what we can do is clamp to these, like, which is a special function that takes 2 parameters, the minimum and the maximum. So for this I'm going to be using 0 and 1, because I want it to be true and false. And I can just do the same here for the other one. So clamp key up plus key down, and use the same minimum and maximum, 0 and 1. So now what we're going to do is that we can go back to the movement calculation and times it by h input and v input. This is because, like, if it's true, so if you're moving horizontally, it would times it all by 1, so it would be fine. However, if it was 0, it wouldn't move. So now, as you can see, we've got a working player movement. So now that we've got a player object that can move, we need to get it to collide into things. Because right now, if I just have any old object here, let's just take the player object because we've only got one, it would just pass right through it, because it would be like, hey, I don't recognize that you're here. I'm just gonna pass through you like you didn't exist. And for a reason, it doesn't really, because to the player, it just sees nothing. And like, so what we could do is have like a big object that just like surrounds the player and serves as a collision using some coding. But that can get a bit annoying for optimization. So what we're gonna do is tile collision, which uses tiles and stuff to make the player collide into things. So what we can do is create a new layer for all of this, so the tile layer. Rename it to collision, and I just deleted it. Make another one. You didn't see that. Rename collision, and now we need a tile set, but we don't have any. So what we do, we make a sprite, call it SVR tile call. Let's set it to 32 by 64 by 32, so it's a big rectangle. And as you can see, there's a grid here in pink, and we only really care about this bit because Gamemaker ignores the first tile, and because Gamemaker's like, yeah, we're gonna use the first tile in the tile set to erase things, but Gamemaker doesn't care what you put in it because it's just gonna delete it. Have this here because that's gonna get deleted anyway. We don't really care. We just care about this white square over here. And let's make a tile set in here. TLS collision. Select sprite. Tile call. 32 by 32. And so as you can see here, because let's just do red. It's only outlined one because. But Gamemaker doesn't care what you put in it because it's just gonna delete it. And you're fine with that. You're like, yeah, you can remove it. I don't care because I didn't put anything important. So now if we go to the game room, go back to this layer, go to tile set, and set it to this tile collision thing that we're doing. We've got this tile and we can just sort of spread it everywhere we want like this, and just create like a place for the player to collide into, like so. Now that we've done that, we can go into the coding part. So first we need to go into the OBJ player create event, because we need to set up a bunch of variables again. So this is for tile collision. Yeah, we can just call it collision. Let's have a tile, the collision layer, well, the collision tile layer, to be more specific, and as a variable name, and let's call it layer get ID. Call it this name right here, so it will be collision. Also, we can make we can do Tilemap, which would be layer get Tilemap. Layer Tilemap get, I think. Tilemap get ID. And from this we can get the layer. We need to use the layer ID here to get the tilemap of this current layer. If you don't understand all of this, everything should be right. Like you don't need to understand all of it, because we will probably go back to it all. So now in the step event, we can go horizontal tile collision, like so. If I can spell correctly, we need to check, hey, are you actually, like player, are you actually colliding with something? So with this we can use a function if tilemap gets at pixel, and it's going to ask for the tilemap element ID, and here we've got the collision tilemap, collision tilemap X and Y, but since it's going to be horizontal, we want like where the player is actually going to be going horizontally, so we're going to be X plus CH move. So if it actually is colliding, we can lastly we've actually got to set its speed to 0, but what we first need to do is set its X to like the very left of the tile that it's colliding with. So X minus equal X mod 32, and what we can actually do here is that we can set another variable, tile size, so the size of each individual one, set it to 32, and then here, instead of using 32, we can just do tile size. And then now that we've done that, we've set the play to the very left of the tile that's colliding with. We can check if it's supposed to be going right, and if it's going right, we can set it to the right of the tile instead. So if we can do this using sign, which gets like the value in here, and just sort of checks, is it positive, is it negative? I'm gonna return 1 or -1, or 0 if it's 0. So sign h move and check if it's positive. So if it equals 1, we can do 8x plus equals collision tile size -1. So now if we run this, just move into one of this, we should see that it does work, but we haven't added the vertical one yet. So I've just got my task manager up here. If I do this, yeah, it just gets kind of glitchy because we haven't actually told it to like do vertical tile collision. But as you can also notice, that it doesn't actually go fully, like not fully into the player, but that's because this collision sort of works on like a single pixel. So like the origin of the players we set earlier this doesn't really matter though, because we can have the player overlaying on things and it should look fine. So as long as this happens, it's alright. So we can do, if we just copy paste this again here, and this will be vertical tile condition. We can, instead of doing exploitation of, we can do y plus vmov, right? And y would, we can just replace all these with y vmov like so, and x replace it with y. It's pretty self-explanatory. This should just do all the same stuff, but with vertical things as well. So now we can just sort of go in the very edges like this, like that. And this concludes our first episode of this tutorial. Hopefully next episode we can replace this player with a nicer looking one and animate it, and we can also do a dodge roll. Have fun and see you later. Bye.